Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm pleased that you're able to join us. My name is Stuart Turner, and I'm here representing the Academy of Urbanism. This is the first in a series of 3 events. Our objective is to consider the impact that COVID-19 pandemic is having and will have on our cities, and in this case, using Milton Keynes as the future of the city as a case study. For those that don't know Milton Keynes, I'll quickly put this in context for you. Milton Keynes is an ambitious city and is looking to grow. Our current population is estimated to be about 270,000 people. There are plans to deliver homes for an increase in the population to around 400,000 people by 2040, and further growth of the city is anticipated that could mean a population of 500,000 people by 2050. All of this is underpinned by a vision for Milton Keynes to be the greenest and the most sustainable city in the world. Hence, trying to understand the impact that COVID-19 pandemic will have. Fortunately, we have what we could be seen as a benchmark, a point of reference to help us with this. The Milton Keynes Strategy for 2050 that was published at the beginning of the year. I said this is the first of 3 events. This one is looking at safer access and seamless travel. The other 2 will be looking at reimagining the city centre on the 19th of August and reinventing the neighbourhood on the 23rd of September. All of this is leading to a further series planned for later in the year that will focus on the Oxford-Cambridge arc and realising their global ambition. I'd like to say just a little about what happens at the end of the 3 events that we're holding. All the ideas being presented will be looked at in more detail by members of the Academy of Urbanism and worked up to draw together some initial conclusions and some thoughts on key action areas. We will be working on this and we'll compile a document and share the conclusions following the end of the 3 events. And I would ask certainly for any further input from members on this. That's certainly welcome. I'd like to finish and hand over to Judith Sykes, Director of Useful Projects, who's the chair for the first session, and who will introduce the speakers. But before I do this, just a couple of points I need to mention. First of all, that the session is being recorded, so please turn off your camera if you don't wish to be part of that. And also use the chat box to log any questions at any time during the sessions, but they'll be picked up and become part of the session. So I'd like to thank everybody from both the AOU and the Milton Keynes Council, and particularly the speakers and the chair for their help. And over to you, Judith. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stuart. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. As Stuart says, I'm Judith Sykes, the Director of Useful Projects, but also a past commissioner for the Milton Keynes 2050 Commission, which ultimately led to the strategy that was published earlier this year. And I'm really delighted to be chairing this event on the future of mobility in the context of Milton Keynes. I think many of us are seeing the impact of lockdown and what that's done in terms of shifting the way in which we travel. And there's definitely advantages of taking a look at what we've learned from that, but also in doing so, make sure we do so in a way that addresses those most vulnerable that have been impacted by the COVID pandemic. We have a really diverse group of people attending today, both those local to Milton Keynes, but also from across the globe. So that's brilliant and should lead to a really interesting conversation. So we'll hear shortly from our 2 speakers, but I do want to sort of reinforce what Stuart said about making sure that you come forward with questions and comments using the comments button on the Zoom, because as Stuart said, we want to capture the output of this, and that provides us with an additional richer dialogue. And then at the end of the session, I'll invite people from that chat box to come forward and ask their questions, or I might sort of group a few of the comments together to put to the panelists. So with that, I would like to introduce our two speakers. We will hear firstly from Neil Taylor, who's Director of Integrated Transport Planning, the consultancy, and he will talk about delivering a publicly accessible transport system in uncertain times. And that will be followed by James Povey, who is a strategic lead in transport planning. He is the Strategic Lead Transport Policy and Planning Officer for Milton Keynes Council. And so he will be talking about realising active travel and an integrated movement network. So I'd like to invite Neil, and if we could bring Neil's slides up, please, to go forth with your presentation.
Thanks, Judith. And I'll just say hi to everybody while Stephen's putting the slides up. Yeah, so picking up on the point that Stuart was making earlier on around Milton Keynes' growth ambitions, it's worth noting that ITP was appointed by Milton Keynes Council to think about the scope for rapid transit within Milton Keynes. And clearly that is a potentially challenging prospect just at the moment. So this presentation is a reflection on what the mass rapid transit proposals linked to longer term growth aspiration looked like and how they might need to evolve in the context of COVID-19. Thanks, Stephen. We can move on to the next slide. So it's worth just highlighting up front that the COVID-19 pandemic is completely unprecedented. I think there are a couple of button pushes as well, Stephen. I shouldn't have designed these in, but hopefully they're not too tedious. I think it's fair to say public transport operators around the world couldn't necessarily have been ready or been expected to be ready to respond, but many have adapted fairly well. Particularly in the UK, we have kind of skeleton schedules, or we had skeleton schedules operating, many of which have been publicly funded. So government has supported public transport operators in uncertain times to ensure that key workers can continue to access employment and treat people, care for us. And I think fundamentally, it almost doesn't matter how sound public transport operators' finances were, those things may be completely irrelevant as a result of public concerns over the transmission of infection. And COVID-19 is an unprecedented example, but the lingering doubts may inhibit people's willingness and ability to use public transport going forward. I think changes in people's working routines and consumer behaviours and travel patterns are probably likely, based on the fact that we're all working from home. Many of us are dialing in from home today, and do we need to continue to use public transport on quite such a regular basis? And then finally, in the UK, certainly government's response and commitment to stimulating the economy, which in the past has tended towards supporting the car industry and getting roads built, and that perhaps can undermine public transport efforts. Thanks, Stephen. Can rattle on to the next slide. It's worth saying that there is a risk to balance here. You know, the risks are not immaterial. So a number of public transport workers, drivers of buses particularly, did die of COVID-19 in the UK, and as a result, there's been a kind of mixed response to the early requirement to wear a face covering on public transport, but nowhere else. And so advocates of public transport maybe felt that public transport networks and systems were being unfairly vindicated against or victimised. And the others would say that actually that's a proportionate response to a very real risk. Thanks, Stephen. Also worth remembering that COVID-19 not necessarily a crisis for everybody. So some companies have done incredibly well because everyone's sat at home streaming movies or buying protective equipment, or indeed cycling. Trying to buy a bike at the moment is incredibly challenging. And on to the next slide. The new normal also may not be sustainable. So anybody who witnessed the large queues outside fast food restaurants when they first reopened their drive-throughs, and still happening, doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to continue walking and cycling for the foreseeable future. And all these things are likely to have an impact on public transport and the demand for it in the future. And if we can just roll on to the next slide, Stephen. There's a sort of a very rough sort of timeline here, I guess, to my personal view, and indeed perhaps an ITP perspective on how and where we might be now. So we've come through a very difficult panic, react and adjust period in the spring. We're into a kind of more reflective, partial return to work, returning to full public transport service, but with social distancing measures in place still, and heading towards a brave new world that we don't perhaps quite know what it looks like. So children are likely to go back to school later this year. It's a unique operating arena, and one that probably we have to recognise not everyone can walk or cycle, not everyone has access to a car, so there's a long-term requirement for public transport, but how it looks and how it feels might be very challenging. And what the new normal looks like, there's an open question about whether UK towns and cities around the world can actually function without public transport. Thanks, Steve. Right on to the next slide. We reflected on the last economic recession in the UK in the context of one that appears to have been widely predicted or is already happening. And it's fair to say that levels of demand really struggled to recover for public transport. So this is trips per person by year by all modes. Well, levels of travel demand haven't recovered back to their pre-financial crash levels yet, or are only just about to do so. So we may expect a lower level of travel demand generally in the future. Next slide. So what way we foresee in the brave new world? Well, social distancing is here for the time being. It may be here until we have a vaccine or until herd immunity is acquired. It's probably accelerating some trends that are happening anyway, and I think James is going to pick up on in the second sort of presentation, but around retail and the fact that it's shifted online, it's accelerated that trend for sure. Around the use of town centres and land in town centres and more local dependence, economic decline in some sectors, and a question about how severely or deeply that happens. And it's worth remembering that the COVID pandemic is one of several current global crises that appear to be playing out concurrently. So the climate emergency has sort of been quietly forgotten, but is still very much there. And I think equality of opportunity and social equity, as the Black Lives Matter campaigns and protests have pointed out, are very sort of permeable issues that aren't going away. Thanks, Steve. So in the context of Milton Keynes, it's worth just reflecting on what we originally proposed. And what we proposed was a network of around about 100 kilometres of mass rapid transit. That mass rapid transit would probably be some form of rubber-tired vehicle, not necessarily a tram, largely because of the infrastructure cost and the higher operating cost of delivering it. But that was very much open at the point that we concluded the study. I think commercial viability definitely rests around something bus-based, but better than a bus, I think is probably the best way to frame it. And those lines are drawn deliberately on a map to reflect locations where Milton Keynes Council is working to rejuvenate or renovate existing estates, and also where local plan and longer term growth allocations are being directed. So the intention being that growth of Milton Keynes can support an enhanced public transport network that meets the needs of existing and future populations. And the intention was to design something that operates at a very high frequency, so the turn up and go style service, probably designed around satisfying that frequency rather than necessarily carrying patronage. So the commercial viability was never really particularly strong from day one, partly on the basis of the patterns of land use in Milton Keynes and partly on the basis of embedded behaviours. But clearly, enhanced connectivity creates opportunity for growth in particular locations and creates opportunity for people to change their patterns of behaviour and consider other ways of getting around. Thanks, Stephen. We've subsequently, working with colleagues at Milton Keynes Council, considered the impact of COVID-19 and in particular the potential need to run more vehicles to satisfy social distancing protocols, run larger vehicles to provide more space, and almost sensitivity tested some of the demand forecasting work that we undertook in order to, if you like, come up with that network plan. It's worth saying that in the near term, there's a sort of overall 25% drop in demand that was what we tested, which is, currently seems fairly optimistic, but longer term is probably not unrealistic, or medium term. It kind of meant that of those 10 lines, only one becomes really commercially viable by 2031. And on an annual basis, there's a sort of additional £1 million a year annual revenue, so if you like, cost recovery shortfall as far as the way the MRT network functions. Applying 2 metre distancing reduces vehicle capacity by around about 80%, so you can imagine the challenge for public transport operators is pretty significant. And consequently, even with some of those adjustments around vehicle size and around operating frequencies, it's only possible to accommodate around 30% of forecast demand. The larger vehicles introduced get closer to 50%, and reducing headway so that you're running more vehicles more frequently enable you to carry 75% of demand, but they also triple operating costs. So you start to see the kind of challenge associated with longer term implications of social distancing if it remains. Thanks, Steve. And that has an impact, I think, in terms of how that network might be envisaged. So are there other ways that people could get around that are perhaps better supportive of social distancing? Walking, cycling, other forms of micromobility, pods, and possibly electric vehicles are all options and all things that Milton Keynes is exploring and has been exploring. And Stephen, I think there are a couple of button pushes on this slide. I think there are two key questions with these. One is, can or would your parents or grandparents use these options? So public transport is something that people do use, particularly older people, in part because they have a free pass to do so. And that is something that probably doesn't exist in respect to these other options. And that's not an insignificant challenge, because the Office for National Statistics forecasts that nearly a quarter of UK residents will be over the age of 65 within this kind of time frame we're talking about for the growth. So that's quite a considerable proportion of the population. Thanks, Stephen. And I guess another question is, will people actually choose to use public transport? So more of us are working from home, more of us are having goods and services brought directly into our homes, or if your Amazon bill is anything like mine over the last few months, you're probably getting things delivered to your door rather than going out and buying them. All of these trends are kind of happening, and I think the longer term view of what they do to public transport is very uncertain. Next slide, please, Stephen. So what might rapid transit look like? Well, in the context of the numbers that we calculated and the sensitivity tests that we applied, we essentially found that the three lines are kind of viable. So the main loop around the centre of Milton Keynes, line 1, which forms a core function, and lines 3 and 6, which serve a sort of growth area towards the southeast of the town, and line 6, which heads out towards the northeast across the M1, both of which also deliver park and rides. After 2031, the longer term sort of, if you like, aggregation of growth gives us an opportunity to bring line 4, so around Woburn Sands, into play. But the remaining lines are very much dependent on the scale of development and demand coming forward. And we think there's probably an opportunity to preserve road space and incrementally add priority for existing bus services that could be converted to mass rapid transit eventually, or indeed prioritised for other forms of mobility, such as those mentioned on previous slides, which James is going to have a chat about later in the next presentation. Thanks, Stephen. Just moving on to the next one. And this clearly, provokes some wider implications for Milton Keynes that would be really great to cover in the discussion. I think open questions around the demand to be in the city centre. Milton Keynes is different to many other UK towns in respect of its function and form, and the role of the central area of Milton Keynes is it going to become more residential in nature? Is it going to continue to be a place where lots of people travel to work or where they go shopping? Public realm related to public transport interchange. So one of the things you do often if you're waiting at a bus stop is queue. You wait next to people. And so the space you need to enable that to happen might influence the design of public realm generally. And the potential to lock in walking and cycling behaviours, as James is going to cover. There are really desirable public health outcomes linked to those, which also satisfy some of the sort of pandemic related mitigation. And finally, equity issues. So lots of people don't have cars. Lots of people will choose not to walk and cycle and rely on public transport. So without an MRT system or without improved public transport in Milton Keynes, are we disadvantaging those groups? That's my final slide, and hopefully roughly within the 10 minutes I was allowed. So I think I'll hand back to Judith.
That's perfect. Thank you, Neil. And just a reminder, if you've got questions for Neil, please put them in the chat box. And with that, we'll hand over to James to talk about active travel. Over to you, James, whilst I think Stephen gets your slides up.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk to you about active travel during lockdown in Milton Keynes and during the ongoing kind of effects of COVID-19 in Milton Keynes, and then tell you a bit about our future plans for active travel, walking and cycling, and how that might change or be influenced by in the context of COVID-19. So it's fair to say active travel is enjoying a bit of a moment in the sun at the moment. The government already had a 2017 cycling and walking strategy with a quite ambitious aims for increasing walking and cycling rates, or doubling of cycling activity by 2025. And they have been putting some increased investment into cycling, particularly, albeit ad hoc and unpredictable rounds of funding, and certainly recent funding that's been granted from government has been kind of needing to be spent in quite short timescales. But only yesterday they produced a further cycling and walking vision, and that's got a real emphasis on increasing and enhancing the quality of cycling infrastructure across the country. So I think it's a good time for cycling and walking. In terms of Milton Keynes Council, it's obviously aims to increase active travel, both the benefits of supporting its growth, reducing congestion, improving people's health, reducing carbon emissions, improving air quality. So a real aim, both nationally and locally, to drive up levels of active travel. Next slide, please. So for those not familiar with Milton Keynes, it has the advantage of a large extent of segregated shared walking and cycling paths known as Redways, and the map there gives you an indication of the coverage of those Redway routes. Also quite ample green spaces around these Redway routes as well. So, but some of you, if you know Milton Keynes, will also be aware it has actually quite low levels of cycling. So journey to work data, the cycling mode share is no better than the English average. Part of that comes down to the high levels of car use and car ownership in Milton Keynes, and the relative ease at which people can drive and use their car. But there are also some reasons around some of the deficiencies with the Redway network as to why the kind of rate of cycling is perhaps as low as it is. However, that said, during the lockdown, it's been quite advantageous to have the segregated network, so it's been able to accommodate an uplift in active travel, and obviously with the wide open spaces, being able to do that safely, and people have been able to social distance while using the Redway routes. Next slide, please. So during lockdown, as I mentioned, the government have been providing funding to local authorities to support active travel, particularly to support social distancing in high streets and busy areas. So the council has taken advantage of some of that funding, has been reallocating some road space, parking space to effectively widen footways. Signage has gone up about social distancing. We've been investing in increased cycle parking provision. And then just also some other activities such as increasing the cutting of the verges alongside Redways, as well as supported the social distancing. Thank you. Next slide. So unsurprisingly, obviously, with the government message people not to use public transport, levels of active travel has increased. So some of the statistics there give a comparison. These are from 10 of our Redway, the counters we have on the Redway network, show how walking and cycling has increased in May compared to May last year, and June compared to last year. Across the network, some counters closer to kind of locations such as central Milton Keynes have actually seen a reduction in overall travel demand and walking and cycling, just because people haven't been travelling to work, and the shopping centre obviously was closed during lockdown as well. So there have been some counters which have had a reduction, whereas there are other counters on the network that have had a marked increase, and the graph there shows the counter around Willen Lake, obviously with an increasing leisure cycling and walkers wanting to get out. That's seen a huge increase in levels. Thank you. Next slide. So there's a question there as to whether that uplift in active travel, could that be sustained? And I think there's already signs perhaps it's dropping off again. The figures from those Redway counters for July showing a continuation of a reduction in active travel. So we perhaps are working our way back to the average for this time of year. And I think some of the barriers to making that a sustained increase and keeping those levels up are some of the deficiencies I referred to earlier with the Redway network. So over many years, we've had feedback and we've been trying to address the situation, quite widely acknowledged that some of the surfacing and the condition of the asset, so condition of subways, the lighting, the wayfinding. Some people have concerns around personal safety as well. Some of the Redway routes aren't particularly well overlooked or suffer from vegetation overgrowth. All these combine to deter people from perhaps using the Redways. Some of the older towns where the urban form, there isn't as much space to accommodate cycle paths and Redways, they lack cycle parking provision. So there are deficiencies there in terms of which could otherwise generate and attract lots of cyclists. And central Milton Keynes itself suffers from a lack of formal cycle provision, certainly east to west through central Milton Keynes. And the images there show looking towards Station Square on the left-hand image and then up towards the shopping centre on the right-hand image. This is a few weeks ago, not during lockdown, but a few weeks ago, these parking access roads that cyclists are generally encouraged to use when going through central Milton Keynes, very quiet, actually quite a pleasant cycling experience to use, but normally these would be full and you'd have cars circulating around them and cars reversing in and out, which makes it for a much more less attractive cycling environment. And that's one of the deficiencies that really needs to be addressed longer term. And obviously cycle parking, secure cycle parking, there's deficiencies there. We'd like to increase levels, and Milton Keynes itself suffers from quite a high level of cycle theft as well. So a lot of the answers to some of those issues is investment in infrastructure. But if we just turn to the next slide, it isn't just about infrastructure. Overall, we want to maximise use of the Redway assets, and part of that is around encouraging a behaviour change. So some of the kind of softer measures of promoting and encouraging people to use the Redways and get on their bikes, making sure people have access to bikes. And so the schemes, commercially operated schemes currently we have in Milton Keynes of Lime, electric bike hire, and the docked Santander bikes that are in the pictures there, help people access bikes. And then there's a wider range of cycling initiatives we undertake in terms of cycle training in schools, the bikeability funding we get from government, as well as trying to tie it in with some of our cultural and historical attractions in Milton Keynes, get people out on the Redways to access some of those and plan their journeys around Milton Keynes. Next slide, please. And then through all this, kind of part of the approach of encouraging more use of the Redways is by accommodating and encouraging a variety of Redway users. So it isn't just pedestrians, it isn't just regular cyclists. We've got potential, e-scooters, you're already seeing e-scooters, so pretty private owned e-scooters, you can see them on the Redways, but we are looking to work, subject to government approval, operate an e-scooter rental trial in Milton Keynes that would be making use of the Redways. We've also got in the picture there, in the centre, the Starship robots. They operate on the Redways and the footways, delivering takeaways and shopping to people's doors. On the right-hand side, we've got an e-cargo bike, and the council have just purchased some e-cargo bikes using a government grant, and we will be leasing those out to interested businesses to try and encourage the use of e-cargo bikes. And then some of the other images there, you've got people, various types of bikes to facilitate people with young children, and then people with mobility difficulties as well, and disabled people. So a real range of people using the Redways, and coupled with that, you've got old people, you've got people in wheelchairs, you've got people, dog walkers, all mixing in the same space. Next slide, please. So in terms of future plans, so infrastructure undoubtedly needs to be improved, and the council is looking to prioritise the 13 cross-city Redway routes for a real focus on upgrading the infrastructure. So that's the Redway super routes. We've just, we're in the process of adopting a new design manual, and one of the key features of that manual is to, similar to the photo in the centre of the slide there, ideally giving subject to where it's safe to do so and the visibility is adequate, we'd like to give Redways priority when they're crossing residential streets. which I think gives an important message out that we're kind of making this space and making it easier for people to get around on their bikes, as well as encouraging a reduced speed, 20 mile per hour type speeds in the residential areas themselves by car users. And obviously that's something we'd like to encourage, and in itself, 20 mile per hour areas encourage people to walk and cycle. We'd like to start work on an infrastructure plan for identifying walking and cycling schemes. And that's really with a view, hopefully over the next 6 months, we'll have a plan in place which will prioritise and work up some designs and business cases for some schemes, so we're ready to take advantage of government funding when it's available, or developer funding if there's new developments in the vicinity. And also we would like to kind of see the delivery of our the application of our transport user hierarchy policy as well. So certainly in new build areas, but also where there are opportunities with public realm improvements and regeneration areas, we'd like to see the application of that hierarchy, which puts the needs of walkers and cyclists at the very top in the design process. And then over time, the intention is for that to evolve our urban environment so they're a lot more favourable for walking and cycling, less dominated by car use, which has been typical of the past in Milton Keynes. Next slide, please. So looking even further beyond that, I think there's some kind of key questions around cycling and supporting active travel long term and the 2050 strategy. Key questions about, should we go further? Is it more, do we have to do more than Redways and upgrading Redways? Do we need to start considering some of the types of infrastructure that are in the images there that are being deployed in other areas, such as dedicated cycle paths, which can enable longer distance and faster cycle journeys? Should we be catering better for cyclists on the grid road, the urban grid roads in Milton Keynes, potentially reducing the speeds on the grid roads, making them a lot safer and more welcoming for cyclists, or putting in more greater segregation and redesigning perhaps our roundabouts to make them safer for cyclists to navigate? I think inevitably there will be a need for more dedicated cycle paths and non-Redway solutions. I think certainly in some of the older towns, Redways just aren't going to be a viable option, and we need to consider a wider range of solutions to deliver cohesive cycling networks, such as quiet streets, as well as dedicated cycle paths. Next slide. And so just in terms of some key messages, I think COVID-19 has only reinforced the need, or raised the importance of walking and cycling and the need for increases in active travel, getting the infrastructure right to support that. I think it's vital that the government backs that up with sustained, predictable funding rounds, as councils can work up schemes and proposals for bids to take advantage of that investment. It's important that the council has the right policies and priorities in place to make sure that investment is invested wisely and in the right things. And then also, I think anything we do, whether it's new Redways or other provision and other changes to the urban form, has to be inclusive and mindful of the range of users, but both range of different types of bikes, but also range of users on the Redways themselves, to ensure that it's inclusive and gives everybody opportunity to stay active. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. I think I'll start off with a question whilst questions are coming through from the audience. I think what your presentations both sort of highlighted for me was that this point about the polarization of different transport modes. So what the pandemic has shown is that there's lots of more people that are using active travel, but there's a danger because of the restrictions around public transport that the other end of that hierarchy is also reinforced, and people will start getting back into their cars. So you've got these sort of two pulls going on. But also, Neil spoke about this point about reflecting on what's gone in the past, and the fact that our modal shifts has been changing since 2008. And so I wondered, in that context, you know, are the way in which we model or plan for, you know, on the historically, which has been a predict and provide model, is that in the bin now, and we're using different ways of modelling and planning for our future infrastructure, both from a technical perspective, but also you talked about the change in hierarchy and making sure that the investment matches that change in hierarchy. So how do we need to rethink about how we plan and design in with that knowledge?
Yeah,
Neil, do you go first? Yeah.
That's fine. Yeah, James, shall I pick up the kind of decide and provide bit if you pick up the active travel hierarchy bit? Is that a good way to handle that?
Yeah.
I think without wanting to speak for Milton Keynes Council particularly, what I would say is that I think the general trend is towards starting to identify the infrastructure or transport service outcomes that are desirable, and then thinking about how you, if you like, leverage growth or government funding to deliver them, rather than necessarily thinking about them as a sort of secondary component of growth. So something you have to do to accommodate growth, which is a sort of, like, as you said, Judith, really turning the telescope around and not thinking about, well, actually the cheapest thing to do is probably just to build more highway and allow more private cars to sort of circulate around Milton Keynes and other towns and cities. I think that it's worth noting, I think the 2050 strategy is very much intended to try and do that. So the part of the idea of almost growing as much as possible within Milton Keynes' own boundaries was around some degree of intensification of land use in certain locations. And ideally, they would be focused upon sort of transit hubs or transit stops, so that you start to deliver the conditions that both support mass rapid transit, but also support healthier lifestyles, less obesogenic environments, ability to walk to kind of convenience retail and kind of local shops and facilities that I don't think Milton Keynes is alone in having perhaps lost to a degree over the last sort of 30, 40 years because of the way we plan and design places. James, I don't know if that's a good point to pick up on the modal hierarchy and your thoughts there.
Yeah, well, I'd agree. Having a kind of a vision-led approach, and like you say, masters of your own destiny. I think the transport user hierarchy fits with that. I think the key to walking and cycling, certainly cycling, is making sure, and the whole government emphasis in this vision and guidance they produced yesterday was really, if you're going to do support cycling, the infrastructure has to be good quality and really meet their needs. You can't just dabble, you can't just do kind of half measures. And the whole transport user hierarchy is really saying, right at the outset of a design process, saying what is it that walkers and cyclists need, and delivering that and making sure that doesn't get compromised then by considerations about what traffic and car parking and things like that, what do they need. So the intention is it might take time, but is then to evolve an have the urban environment so it looks appealing to walk and cycle, and that is the kind of default choice for people in those locations, rather than, as it is in many cases in Milton Keynes at the moment, people just choose to get in their car just because it's convenient and easy, and actually it's too dangerous or difficult for them to get on their bikes to get to some locations.
Actually, that's a really good point to bring in. I think I'd like to unmute Shane and invite him to ask his conversation, because that point about getting into people's cars isn't available for everybody, and he makes an important observation around inclusiveness in this conversation. Shane, are we able to get Shane to ask his question, make his comment?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's great.
Hi. Yes, my question was particularly about areas of deprivation and in terms of equality of access. All of this sounds like very costly, and how do we ensure that that barrier of cost, particularly in areas of deprivation, does not mean that we end up with a two-speed system in terms of access? It's only the people that can afford to travel will do so, when actually we need everyone across the city to travel for work, for leisure, and to better themselves and skills and employment as well.
So should we go in reverse order this time, James, and then Neil?
Well, in terms of costliness and price, I think a lot of cycling schemes, certainly if you're putting in a new cycle path or cycle provision that doesn't exist, the cost benefits are very good. So it might cost a bit of money up front, but they are good value investments. I think obviously once they are in place, they provide a free form of travel generally for people to make use of in deprived areas. So I don't know, and I think a lot of car solutions that we already have in place to support car use and car access are much more expensive. So it's just getting the balance right, and actually perhaps putting less emphasis on providing and putting in provision for cars and upgrading junctions for traffic generated by developments, and putting more into good quality active travel infrastructure, and that's where a lot of the travel demand will be met.
Neil.
Yeah, I can come in on that. I think, James, you sort of alighted on a point around the cost of car-based approaches, and I think it's much about the, if you like, the unseen incentivization. So, for example, quite affordable parking charges and plentiful parking space next to most destinations is a good example of how, I guess, there's a fairly subtle but fairly clear prioritization, or if you like, there's not a disincentive to drive, and the same is true in many towns and cities in the UK, not just Milton Keynes, but it does vary from place to place. So it tends to reflect the scarcity of parking, but also conscious policy choices about how easy you wish to make it for people to drive right to the door of the place they're going to, and indeed right into the heart of a town or a city. And I think there's a point made in relation to that about the extent of congestion and convenience and cost that I think Simon Pugh's just made towards the bottom of the chat that very much relates to that. What I would say on the MRT side of things is that one of the reasons the commercial viability was challenging, particularly in the COVID-19 context, is that we used a £2 average fare as the basis for, if you like, the cost recovery scenario. So we didn't inflate that with inflation, we just did it in very simple terms, because that was as far as the scope of the work and the initial sort of cost estimation required. But that is a fairly low average fare, I think, or fairly commensurate average fare at other places. So on affordability grounds, there's no sort of sky high rapid transit premium being charged for a sort of 2-speed service. The intention is it probably evolves bus services that are already viable into becoming more rapid, more frequent, higher quality services that are more attractive to use, because there's a very clear understanding that the groups that rely upon them probably also struggle to afford something more expensive. Clearly, one of the things that could happen as a result of COVID-19 is that public transport fares across the country may go up. That's one of the realities of for public transport operators having to equate quite fixed and quite high costs with declining revenues. You'd hope that there'd be a policy response around other forms of mobility that rebalances that or sets it in context.
Thank you. And it just really sort of places, for me, greater emphasis on the need to, make Milton Keynes is quite a compact city in many ways, and so that focus on active travel so that it can be more inclusive. And on that note, I just wanted to pull in 2 questions that weave them together, if I may, on behalf of Robin, Roy and Simon Pugh. So Robin is making the point that active travel policy should include electric bikes, but also what we're seeing is a much more diverse range of mobility vehicles, as James sort of put up, but cargo bikes, delivery services by bikes. And then, Simon is also saying that not all Redways are shared, some have additional footpaths. And so how do you take account of these sort of different active modes and put them together so it really does hang together as a comprehensive strategy which doesn't maybe undermine one particular user of that network? So start with you, Neil.
No, it's a good point. I remember, so we've done a bit of work with John Parkin at UWE on cycle network design, and one of the things that he says that always sticks in my mind is that a bicycle is a vehicle designed for speed. And so the fact that you can hurtle along on a bike quite happily at 15 to 20 miles an hour and do so on a path that you share with pedestrians, some of whom may be vulnerable, some of whom may be young children that move erratically, or dogs on leads, is an interesting kind of equation. I think if you fell to Earth from space and saw that happening, you'd kind of wonder why. And I think it becomes more apparent as the number of people looking to cycle changes. So particularly looking to cycle for functional reasons rather than for leisure, when your speed and your purpose might be more clear. Now that's challenging because I think not just in Milton Keynes but across the whole country we have a legacy of shared use paths which were essentially either adjacent to highway, or Milton Keynes is blessed with an off-highway network. And I think there's a point about its discoverability. And also I think the width of some of those paths generally can be challenging in places, particularly, they're well used by people on mobility scooters or in wheelchairs as well, because they're often quite flat and quite smooth. Not always, as James said, you can see some issues with condition here and there, but those kind of issues generally get resolved through reallocation of space. So whether that's using verges to widen them, improving the quality of them, or indeed starting to somehow segregate them slightly. James, I don't know if you want to pick up on that point.
Yeah, I think with the cycle walking vision that the government came out with yesterday, there was some blunt messages there saying that shared paths wouldn't be funded. But I think if you dig a little bit deeper into the guidance and the technical notes behind it, I think obviously they're against shared paths in streets, and I would say that to mean more town centre type locations where they're going to have much higher levels of pedestrian footfall. And I think that's a fair conclusion to say that shared paths aren't an appropriate solution in those locations. I think in Milton Keynes, the Redways generally are very quiet, they're underutilised. I don't think there is that problem in a lot of locations on the Redways. And so I'd say, hopefully being pragmatic, the government would still say actually Redways do work in Milton Keynes fine, and it's fine to be funding and improving those. But I think it does raise a question that where there are locations where there are busier, you get more conflict with pedestrians. Willen Lake and the path around Willen Lake is a real example. It's wider than your standard Redway, but there's so many people there, there's lots of conflict. So I think that particularly is an example where a segregated solution, and the government are emphasising segregation needs to be more than just a white line, needs to be a physical curb at least. That's where you perhaps need to start considering some of those other solutions that haven't perhaps been in our kind of palette of approaches for supporting walking and cycling in the past in Milton Keynes, but perhaps we do need a more varied approach to how we deliver a cohesive network for the whole of Milton Keynes.
Okay, that's great. And there's a lot of chat a lot of the comments on the chat are related to the Redways, and I'd like to invite Daniel Shahidi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, to make his comment, which is I think going to be sort of a little bit challenging on how we move from some of these principles to actions. So Daniel, would you like to, can we unmute Daniel to make his point?
Yeah, hello, am I there?
Hi, yes, you're on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just repeat what I suppose my question really, but I've just, I've looked back at documents back in the 70s, all the way through the 80s, various cycling organisations and, from the council or community-led groups have talked about issues and Redways, the lack of uptake in cycling, and the lack of investment in all the things that are wrong with the Redways around navigation and surface. And so why can we believe there's change now? Because it feels like otherwise it's more promises, I guess, and people get tired.
So there is a bigger opportunity, and so how do we take advantage of that, James? Thank you for your question, Daniel.
Yeah, well, I'd agree with Daniel. It's like I say, I said in my presentation, you need a sustained and predictable funding stream from government for cycling and walking improvements. Even with their own 2017 strategy, they had all these ambitions. There was very limited funding that was then made available for delivering that. They seem to have woken up now with COVID-19 and be putting money into it. But again, at the moment, there's no sign of a sustained funding programme. It's just ad hoc releases of funding, has to be spent in very short time scales. Councils, you need that predictability to know in years 3, 4, 5, there's going to be a chunk of money available to invest in some schemes. The council then got a chance to work up designs and the cases for the schemes to take advantage of that. If you suddenly just spring it on them, it's very difficult to then deliver schemes and have a plan in place with all these improvements in it. So funding is key. We're doing as much as we can to try and get money from developers and new developments in Milton Keynes, but there will be a reliance on council leaders, the politicians putting more money into it, and government providing more funding streams and more predictable funding streams, sustained funding streams for it as well.
Neil,
Yeah, I can offer a quick perspective. I think Daniel's question is really valid, and it is one, not just Milton Keynes, lots of towns and cities go around the houses on, literally around the houses, ironically. I think the growth allocations and growth potential for Milton Keynes actually offers some opportunity. So the kind of design and layout of those places, one of the opportunities is around completely flipping, if you like, the level of priority that's given to car-based movement relative to walking and cycling. So an observation, I think, if you came to Milton Keynes for the first time, would be that it's really obvious where the roads are, but it's not really obvious where the footpaths and the cycleways are. And actually, in new growth areas, you have a great opportunity, particularly where they're being delivered at scale, to establish those or re-establish those principles in a different way. And I think the other side of that coin is around density and around the mix of land uses. So Milton Keynes, like other places, probably less so Milton Keynes actually, because of its grid square patterns and its nature, but it does have sort of monocultural land use allocations, and so large swathes of residential and then commercial in blobs and retail in specific places. Actually mixing that up a little bit so that people can walk and cycle shorter distances to get to those sorts of things on a very visible network is probably key to establishing that and achieving it. I think it is much harder to do in existing places, and that's playing out not just in Milton Keynes but everywhere around the country. There's a legacy of network that's very hard to change. Reprioritising road space is really challenging. And even in places where it's been done very successfully, like Waltham Forest in London, it took literally running battles between bold councillors, transport planners, land use planners, and local traders and residents. And actually trying it is probably the key. Trying it and seeing whether it works is really important, because Waltham Forest, widely held up as a great example and a very successful one. But you probably couldn't just roll that out everywhere.
Thanks. And I think actually that sort of relays then maybe onto a question around governance. And so I just need to peer into my screen, but there was a question around from Shane. Yes. So does this multiplicity of provision need a joined up single point of access and maybe a new transport authority to deliver it? And sort of related Tim Skelton's questions, then if you had a transport policy, would governance structure, would it be easy then to cross-fund and raise revenues from, say, parking to cross-fund other modes? So what's the governance and financing structure for Milton Keynes to realise this? Is there a different way of thinking about it? Sorry, Neil, back to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure, if I'm honest. So if you look historically at cities that do have a transport authority or a transport executive function, they haven't really achieved much more on cycling. It's only really recently that Manchester and Birmingham are starting to get their act together and really prioritise funding towards more active modes of travel, and probably be a little bit more progressive around car-based or if you like, less car-based modes and priorities. And I think that is largely happening out of necessity rather than out of a particular desire. Certainly early on, I think Manchester's probably the exception with its B-line network, which has been a very conscious choice, but it's also a response to the fact that congestion has become so bad and air quality has become so poor that something else needs to happen. I think also Milton Keynes is already a unitary, so it is blessed with control over its planning and its transport functions. The only real challenge it has is the deregulated public transport environment, I think, in terms of working with bus operators. There's quite a good partnership arrangement there already that offers great scope to do it. So I would say sometimes there's a tendency to think, more powers or more control is what's needed, when actually it's probably as much about political will and where you point your funding and how you allocate land.
James, can you comment on that?
Well, briefly, I'll probably pick up on that last point. Really, I have to be careful what I say as a council employee. I think it comes down to leadership, really, isn't it? And I think those areas that have delivered really kind of game-changing infrastructure, whether typically they've had a mayor in place, but they've benefited from strong leadership. I don't necessarily think you need a mayor, but whether it's a strong leading party or cross-party support for investing in a sustained investment in walking and cycling, but that's what's required, I think, to make the difference, and that's what separates some local authorities from other local authorities, I think.
I can add quickly to that, Judith, it's helpful. I asked a question of Chris Boardman at a conference about 2 years ago, where he and Suzanne Clarice, I think, and others who delivered really kind of game-changing infrastructure in London and about to deliver it in Manchester, were talking about cycling networks. And they seem to alight on three things. One was about political will, one was about financial capital, so you could call it political capital, financial capital, and then, if you like, public capital, so the will of the people. To what extent are people asking for this? And I said, you know, those three things, which of them's most important? And it sparked off a really interesting conversation, and they concluded they're all really important, but actually the most important one is the political will, because the political will drives the desire for how you spend the budget you have, or how you seek more budget to deliver what you need. And the public support tends to follow if you do it well. It's very rare that the public support drives the, if you like, drives the conversation towards an outcome.
Yeah, and that's the example, the Waltham Forest example, that you need the political will in hand with the community consultation, and because we haven't talked too much about how you engage communities and businesses and practices in this sort of transition to, you know, different modes of travel. But I can see from the conversation it's really important, and especially because so much of the chat as well has got some very specific observations on what can be improved within the Redway network. I probably should sum up what I think we've captured. I promised the Academy of Urbanism that I would try and make sense of some themes that have come out of this conversation. So what I have taken from it is that the economics of public transport has really shifted as a result of COVID, and the way in which we plan future, particularly around the public transport. We do need to think differently, perhaps, about that. The investment in transport and what's happened has knock-on consequences to what's happening in the high street and retail. So transport and thinking about mobility needs to happen in the context of our thinking about planning our urban centres as well. So we've seen the uplift in active travel, which has been brilliant, but we need to make sure that we don't lose that momentum and that it doesn't decline and we all get back in our cars. And a couple of points about the inclusivity and the need to be inclusive, to make sure that any future transport modes are affordable and inclusive. And we also talked about that in relation to active travel and these sort of different speeds, different modes, different functions of sort of active travel paths. You both sort of highlighted the importance of that sustained and predictable funding streams to really make this happen. And I think your sum up there, Neil, about the sort of three capitals that are required to make that happen is really important. So the social, the political, and the funding capital that's required. Generally, and I think local authorities are trying to get their head around this, but you've articulated it quite well, James, this importance of flipping the priority, but making sure that funding follows that flipping priority as well, and related to sort of prioritising funding in active travel, just recognising just how hard it is to do within the existing fabric of the city, and so sharing best practice and case studies around that, I think it's key. And then just lastly, and this picks up everybody's comments in the tracks, is it feels like the Redways are a huge asset within Milton Keynes, and there's a great desire that they should be improved from navigation, signage, and so hopefully, James, you can get hold of that funding from government to make it happen. So I'd like to sort of thank everybody for their contributions, but particularly James and Neil, brilliant conversation and discussion, and thank you everyone.